Hi and welcome to my channel. I was 41 years old when my carefully constructed life started to unravel. My name is Daniel Morgan, an aerospace engineer living in Austin, Texas. My wife, Karen, was 38, a beautiful, driven entrepreneur who had turned a small vintage boutique into a thriving online fashion empire. We had been married for 15 years with 2 kids, Max, 13, a budding artist with a penchant for sketching, and Mia, 10, whose soccer trophies already cluttered our suburban home shelves. Life had been good, or so I thought. It all started on a crisp October evening. Karen was hosting her monthly wine club with a group of local moms. I had no reason to suspect anything. I mean, she'd been doing these gatherings for years, and the ladies seemed harmless enough. But that night, something nagged at me. I was in my workshop out back, tinkering with an old motorcycle engine, when I realized I'd left my phone in the house. I walked through the back door, intending to grab it from the kitchen counter, when I heard hushed voices from the living room. At first, it seemed like harmless gossip, who was divorcing whose kid had flunked math. But then, my wife's voice rose just enough to make me stop mid-step. And Mark just gets me in ways Daniel never could. I froze. Karen, laughing lightly, continued, "It's not serious. We're just close. He makes me feel alive, you know?" There was a chorus of giggles and murmured encouragements from the other women. I couldn't make out what they said next because the blood pounding in my ears drowned everything else out. Mark? Who the hell was Mark? For a moment, I considered barging in, demanding answers. But instead, I quietly stepped back out the door, the chill of the evening air doing little to cool the fire burning in my chest. The morning after the wine club gathering, I couldn't focus on anything else. Mark echoed in my mind like a scratched record. Who was this man? And what did he mean by alive? Karen went about her morning routine as if nothing had happened. Brewing coffee in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, laughing at some TikTok video. I forced myself to stay calm, but inside, I was unraveling. If I wanted answers, I'd have to be methodical. That meant starting with the one thing that rarely lied: finances. I had never paid much attention to our money situation. Karen handled most of it, thanks to her business acumen. I earned a solid $120,000 annually from my engineering job, and Karen's boutique brought in what I assumed was a comfortable supplement, maybe another $70,000. Together, we lived well, but not lavishly. A 4-bedroom home in the suburbs, 2 cars, a Tesla for her, a reliable Ford for me, and yearly vacations to Colorado or the Florida Keys. But when I opened our joint bank account that morning, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was a series of withdrawals. $1,500 here, $2,000 there, all labeled as consulting fees. The amounts were too irregular to be bills, and I didn't recall Karen mentioning any consultants for her boutique. A sinking feeling set in as I clicked through the statements. Over the last 6 months, more than $20,000 have been funneled out under these cryptic charges. Then came the credit card. Karen had her own business card, but we shared a family account for household expenses. That account was littered with purchases I couldn't explain. Expensive restaurant tabs at high-end places downtown, hotel charges under generic names like Austin Suites, and most damning, a charge from a jewelry store for $5,800. I stared at the receipt detail. Men's platinum watch. I didn't wear watches. My gut churned, but I wasn't done. If Karen was funneling money, there had to be more. I opened her boutique's account records, where her business earnings were deposited. Unlike our personal finances, I didn't have full access to these accounts, just a limited view she'd granted me for tax purposes. Even so, I noticed a recurring payment to someone named Mark D. for $3,500 a month. It was right there, staring me in the face. Karen was funding her affair. I couldn't sit on this. That night, after the kids were in bed, I confronted her. "Karen," I began, my voice betraying none of the storm inside me. "I was reviewing our accounts today. There are some charges I don't recognize." Her eyes flickered, just for a second. "Patel, what charges?" she asked innocently, sipping her wine. "Oh, like the $5,800 at a jewelry store, or the thousands funneled to Mark D. every month." Her glass froze midair. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said too quickly. "Mark D. is a supplier. He sources vintage pieces for the boutique." "Vintage pieces?" I leaned forward, letting my words cut like a knife. Do these vintage pieces happen to include platinum men's watches? The room fell into a suffocating silence. Then she sighed, a deep, weary sound that sent my anger boiling over. It's not what you think, she started. Then what is it, Karen? Because it looks like you're using family money to bankroll some guy named Mark. I was going to tell you, she snapped, her composure cracking. It's complicated. He's helping me expand the business. We're opening another boutique in Dallas. It was such a pathetic excuse, it was almost laughable. Opening a boutique? I hissed. With jewelry? With expensive dinners and hotels? I didn't mean for you to find out like this, she whispered, tears now pooling in her eyes. Mark and I, he's just someone I lean on. You're never around, Daniel. You're always buried in your work, and I'm lonely. Her voice broke, and for a moment I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with. But then the image shattered. Lonely, I repeated, my voice cold. So you fixed that by draining our accounts for someone else? She didn't answer. After Karen's tearful confession, or half-truth, as I suspected, I couldn't let it end there. Something felt too deliberate, too calculated. Mark D. wasn't just a fling. He was entrenched in her life, in her business, and by extension in mine. The boutique, our finances, our marriage, it was all intertwined, and unraveling it would take more than accusations. That night, I slept in the guest room. Or rather, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, piecing together a plan. The next morning, Karen was distant but quiet, as though waiting for me to make the next move. She kissed Max and Mia goodbye as they left for school, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a brittle facade. Where are you headed? She asked as I grabbed my keys. Work, I replied curtly, and maybe a meeting with our accountant. Someone needs to make sense of the mess you've created. Her face paled, but she didn't argue. At lunch, I met with Evan, our family's accountant. Evan was a sharp, no-nonsense guy who had handled our taxes for years. I told him I wanted a full audit of our accounts, both personal and business. He raised an eyebrow at the urgency, but didn't press. Something specific you're looking for, he asked. Yes, I said flatly. I want to know where the hell $20,000 has gone in the past 6 months. Evan promised to dig into the numbers, but his expression told me I wasn't going to like the results. While I waited for his report, I began my own investigation. Karen may have thought she'd covered her tracks, but she'd underestimated how much I could unearth with a little persistence. I started with her boutique's website. At first glance, it looked normal. Trendy vintage clothes, well-photographed inventory, and a polished branding style that screamed Karen's touch. But as I navigated deeper, something caught my eye, a small, poorly hidden tab labeled Exclusive Partnerships. Clicking through, I found a series of promotional posts tied to a second business, MD Custom Jewelry Designs. There was again Mark D. The website for MD Custom Jewelry was rudimentary, almost amateurish, with a handful of pieces on display. The prices were exorbitant. $15,000 for a diamond bracelet, $20,000 for a one-of-a-kind necklace. But the kicker? Most of the items were listed as sold. The timestamps on the sales were suspiciously recent, coinciding with Karen's consulting fees and credit card charges. I pulled up our boutique's purchase orders from the business account, cross-referencing them with the jewelry site. Sure enough, Karen had bought several pieces. But why? The boutique didn't sell jewelry, and none of the items appeared in her inventory. I sat back, staring at my screen. This wasn't just an affair. Karen and Mark were laundering money, my money. Evan called later that afternoon, his tone grim. Daniel, I've finished my preliminary review, he began. There are discrepancies in your wife's boutique finances. Define discrepancies, I said tightly. Well, for starters, there's a separate account she opened last year. It's not under your joint records, but I found it linked to her business taxes. As of today, there's about $57,000 in that account. Most of it comes from payments labeled sales commissions. Sales commissions? I echoed. To whom? A single recipient. Mark Davidson. The name hit me like a hammer. So Mark had a last name now, and a direct pipeline to my family's money. I returned home late, clutching a file Evan had compiled, detailing every transfer, every purchase, every cent that had gone missing. Karen was in the kitchen, pretending to flip through a cookbook. The air was heavy with unspoken words. Karen, I said, slamming the file on the counter. Explain this. She glanced at the papers, her face tightening. I told you Mark and I are business partners, she said weakly. No, Karen, you're funneling money to him. Almost $60,000 of it. Do you think I'm stupid? Her composure cracked. It's not what you think. Mark, he's an investor. He's helping expand the boutique. Cut the crap, I shouted, the anger I'd held back exploding. You're using me as a piggy bank for your lover's scam? Karen's tears started again, but this time, I didn't care. I grabbed the file and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. In the driveway, I pulled up Mark Davidson's name on my phone, searching for anything that might give me leverage. What I found made my blood run cold. Mark wasn't just a grifter. He was a serial fraudster, with lawsuits and arrests stretching back nearly a decade. He conned several women into similar business ventures, draining their finances before vanishing. But this time, he'd picked the wrong husband to mess with. With Mark's sordid history laid bare, the betrayal felt even more personal. This wasn't just about money. It was about my wife's willingness to bring a man like him into our lives, into my house. That night, as I sat in my car outside a 24-hour diner, poring over the documents Evan had given me, I couldn't stop picturing Karen with Mark. Her laugh, her touch, things that had once belonged to me, shared with this man who'd turned my life into a financial and emotional minefield. If the money trail wasn't enough, I needed proof of the affair to confront her fully. That meant playing the long game. The next morning, I called Evan to solidify my financial protections. First, I transferred what remained in our joint savings, $28,000, into a new account in my name only. Then I froze all our credit cards except one, which I left active to track Karen's spending. I also notified the bank of potential fraudulent activity on our boutique's business accounts. If Karen tried to withdraw more funds, she'd be blocked. That afternoon, I hired a private investigator named Jake Marlowe. He was an ex-cop with a reputation for discretion and results. I explained the situation, Mark, Karen, the suspicious financial transfers, and he assured me he'd dig up whatever skeletons were hiding in their closets. Give me a week, Jake said, his tone confident. We'll find out exactly what your wife and her boyfriend are up to. In the meantime, I kept a low profile at home. Karen seemed tense, but she didn't press me about my outburst the night before. She likely thought her tears had bought her some time. But I noticed her phone was glued to her hand more than usual. Late-night texts, quick, hush calls she claimed were work-related. On Friday, I found my excuse to leave. I've got a project deadline, I told her over dinner. I'll be at the office all weekend. She nodded, her gaze darting to her phone again. All right, just don't overwork yourself. I could barely hold back a bitter laugh. As soon as I left the house, I parked 2 streets away and waited, watching the front door through binoculars. Sure enough, less than an hour later, Karen emerged, dolled up in a tight red dress I hadn't seen before, her hair and makeup immaculate. She climbed into her Tesla and sped off. I tailed her, keeping a safe distance. She drove downtown, pulling into the valet at the Paramount, one of Austin's swankiest hotels. My stomach twisted as she stepped out, greeted by none other than Mark Davidson. He kissed her cheek, a gesture so casual it burned me. They disappeared inside together, and I knew I couldn't wait for Jake's report. I needed answers now. The next morning, Jake called. His voice was sharp, businesslike. Got something for you, he said. It's worse than you think. Worse? I echoed. How? For starters, your wife isn't Mark's only business partner. He's got a string of women funding his schemes, all under the guise of these fake investments. But that's not the kicker. I gripped the phone tighter. Mark isn't just her lover. He's been using Karen's boutique to launder money for a much bigger operation. We're talking 6 figures, maybe more. The air felt sucked out of the room. Laundering for what? Drugs, most likely, Jake said bluntly. There's a network of shady accounts tied to his name, and your wife's business is smack in the middle of it. That evening, I confronted Karen with what I'd learned. I know about Mark, I said coldly as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. I know everything. Her face fell, but she didn't deny it. I was going to tell you, she whispered. Tell me what? That you're screwing him? That you're laundering money for him? Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Finally, she managed. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Mark, he said it was temporary, a way to boost the boutique's profits. I barked a laugh, cold and humorless. Profits? Karen, You're an accomplice to a criminal." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the laundering. I just wanted to feel wanted again. And you thought the best way to do that was to betray me? To put our entire family at risk." My voice cracked with anger. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she choked out. "Mark, he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But I love you, Daniel. I do." I shook my head, disgusted. "Love? You don't destroy someone you love, Karen. And you sure as hell don't let some sleazebag criminal crawl into your bed." Her tears flowed freely now, but they didn't move me. "Not anymore. I want you out of this house," I said finally. "Tomorrow." "Daniel, please," she begged. "Let's talk. There's nothing left to talk about. You made your choices. Now I'm making mine." Karen didn't leave the next day. Despite my ultimatum, she lingered, claiming she needed time to explain things to the kids. I let her stay temporarily, not wanting to cause a scene in front of Max and Mia. But I wasn't about to let her stall indefinitely. Meanwhile, Jake Marlowe's investigation went deeper. By midweek, he'd uncovered enough dirt on Mark Davidson to fill a filing cabinet. Not only was Mark laundering money through Karen's boutique, but he'd also conned at least 4 other women into similar schemes. Each one had been left financially and emotionally ruined. One of them, a former tech executive, had lost over $200,000. What Jake hadn't found yet was Mark's endgame. Where was the laundered money going? Who was pulling the strings? And, most urgently, how much danger were Karen and I in? On Thursday night, as I sat reviewing Jake's latest findings, Karen appeared in the doorway of my home office. She looked drained, her once flawless confidence crumbling. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice shaky. "We need to talk." I didn't look up. "What is it now?" "It's Mark," she said, stepping inside. "He's threatening me." That got my attention. I set down the papers and stared at her. "Threatening you how?" Karen wrung her hands, pacing the room. "He knows I've been pulling back. I haven't answered his calls all week, and I stopped the transfers from the boutique account. Now he's saying if I don't keep helping him, he'll come after me." My jaw tightened. "After you? Or us?" She hesitated, and the silence told me everything I needed to know. Mark wasn't just a con man, he was dangerous. The next day, Jake called with more bad news. "I've been keeping an eye on Mark," he said, "and it looks like he's caught wind of our investigation." "What do you mean?" I asked. "He started covering his tracks. Accounts are being closed, and the money's being moved offshore. He's also hired someone, a guy named Victor Cardoza." I felt a chill. "Who's that?" "Muscle," Jake said bluntly. "Ex-con, history of violence. He's a fixer, Daniel. Mark's cleaning house, and your wife's part of the mess." That night, Karen's Tesla was gone when I got home. At first, I assumed she was at the boutique, but then I noticed her laptop and several bags were missing. A sinking feeling hit me as I checked the tracking app on her phone. It showed her at an address downtown, Mark's apartment. I knew I couldn't wait for Jake or the police. If Karen was walking into a trap, I had to stop her. Mark's building was a sleek, modern high-rise with a doorman. I parked down the street and entered the lobby, keeping my head low. The doorman barely glanced at me as I stepped into the elevator, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and fear. When the doors opened on the 12th floor, I heard raised voices coming from an apartment at the end of the hall. One of them was Karen's. "You said this would be safe," she was yelling. "You promised no one would get hurt." I crept closer, staying out of sight. Mark's voice followed, calm but menacing. "Relax, Karen. Everything's under control. Just keep playing your part, and we'll both walk away clean." "I'm done," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't do this anymore." Mark laughed coldly. "You think you can just walk away? After everything I've done for you? After everything you owe me?" I heard a loud thud, like something or someone being slammed against a wall. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay quiet, waiting for the right moment. Then came a sound that made my heart stop. Karen screaming. I burst through the door without thinking. The scene inside was chaos. Karen was backed into a corner, her face pale with terror. Mark stood over her, his hand gripping her wrist tightly. His other hand held a knife. "Let her go," I growled, stepping forward. Mark turned, surprised but not rattled. "Well, if it isn't the husband," he said with a smirk. "Come to play hero. Have you?" I glanced at Karen, who was crying but otherwise unharmed. You don't want to do this, Mark, I said, keeping my voice steady. Let her go, and we can all walk away. He laughed again. Walk away? From this? You've got no idea what you're in the middle of. Then why don't you tell me? I said, inching closer. But before he could answer, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Mark's smirk faltered. You called the cops? He snarled at Karen. She shook her head frantically. I didn't, I swear. Mark cursed under his breath, shoving Karen aside. Then he bolted for the fire escape, disappearing into the night. Karen collapsed to the floor, sobbing. I knelt beside her, torn between fury and relief. This isn't over, I muttered. Not by a long shot. The police arrived minutes after Mark fled, their lights bathing the high-rise in harsh reds and blues. Karen, still trembling, recounted the confrontation as officers took notes. I stood back, arms crossed, fury bubbling beneath my skin. For years, I had seen Karen as my partner, my equal. Now, she was the weak link in a game I didn't know I was playing. After the officers left, Karen and I drove home in silence. She clutched her seatbelt like it was a lifeline, avoiding my gaze. The house was dark when we arrived, the kids asleep upstairs. Once inside, I turned to her. We're done, I said flatly. I don't care what it takes or how long it takes, but we're ending this. Daniel, Stop, I snapped. I don't want to hear excuses. You put all of us in danger for a fling and a fraud. Do you even understand what you've done? Tears filled her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I'll call my lawyer tomorrow, I continued. You'll move out by the end of the week. And if Mark comes near us again, I'll do whatever it takes to keep him away. Understand? Karen nodded silently, her face a mask of regret. The next morning, I called Jake. We need to finish this, I told him. If Mark thinks he can walk away, he's dead wrong. Jake agreed to accelerate his investigation. By midday, he'd uncovered a new lead. One of Mark's offshore accounts had been flagged for suspicious activity by an international banking watchdog. It wasn't just laundering anymore. It was fraud on a global scale. The guy's a small cog in a big machine, Jake said over the phone. Whoever he's working with isn't going to let him screw up their operation. If we press him, he'll fold. And how do we find him? I asked. Jake chuckled darkly. He's slippery, but he's not a ghost. Give me 2 days. While Jake hunted Mark, I focused on securing my family. I contacted an attorney to begin divorce proceedings, insisting on a swift separation. Karen protested, begging for another chance, but my resolve was unshakable. I can't trust you, I told her bluntly. And without trust, there's no marriage. She cried, pleaded, and even promised to cut all ties with Mark, but I had no room left for mercy. Every dollar she'd funneled to him, every lie she'd told, every moment of betrayal had drained me dry. I wasn't just ending our marriage. I was severing her from my life entirely. 2 days later, Jake called with an update. We found him, he said. He's holed up in a motel outside of San Antonio. Looks like he's waiting for a fake passport to skip the country. Do the cops know? I asked. They do now, Jake replied. But you might want to get there first. I didn't hesitate. The 2-hour drive felt like an eternity, my mind racing with what I'd do when I saw Mark again. Confronting him wasn't just about vengeance. It was about closure. I needed him to see the damage he'd caused and know that I wouldn't let him escape unscathed. When I arrived, the motel was a grimy, rundown place, the kind of spot where nobody asked questions. I parked down the street and watched the entrance, my heart pounding. Then I saw him. Mark, carrying a duffel bag, walking toward a beat-up sedan. Before I knew what I was doing, I was out of the car, striding toward him. Mark! I barked. He froze, turning slowly. When he saw me, his lips curled into a smug grin. Daniel, he said, his tone mocking. Didn't expect to see you here. Drop the bag. I growled, closing the distance between us. Or what? He taunted. You gonna hit me? Call the cops? Face it, you're out of your depth. I stopped inches from him, my fists clenched. This ends now. You're not running. You're not hiding. You're going to pay for everything you've done. Mark laughed, a low, cruel sound. Pay? I don't owe anyone a thing. Least of all you. Before I could respond, a pair of black SUVs screeched into the parking lot, their doors flying open. Men in tactical gear spilled out, guns drawn. Freeze! One of them shouted. Mark Davidson, you're under arrest. Mark's grin vanished as they tackled him to the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back. I stepped back, watching as they hauled him to his feet. "Looks like the end of the line," I muttered. Mark shot me a glare. "You think you've won?" he spat. "This isn't over, Morgan. Not by a long shot." As the SUVs drove away, taking Mark with them, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The man who had torn my life apart was gone, but the scars he'd left behind would take much longer to heal. Mark Davidson was behind bars, but the damage he'd caused was far from contained. Over the following weeks, the investigation into his laundering scheme expanded. FBI agents questioned Karen repeatedly, their inquiries pulling apart every detail of her business and personal finances. It became painfully clear how deeply entangled she had been with him, both financially and emotionally. Meanwhile, the divorce process churned on. Karen remained in the house. Though we lived in separate spaces, our interactions reduced to curt exchanges about the kids or logistics. But the silence wasn't enough to contain my anger. Every time I looked at her, the same questions gnawed at me. How long had she been seeing Mark? How had I missed the signs? And, worst of all, had she ever truly loved me? One night, unable to sleep, I decided to dig deeper. Karen had left her laptop in the living room, and though part of me felt guilty, I couldn't resist the temptation. I opened it, scrolling through her emails and messages with growing dread. There was months of correspondence with Mark. "Can't stop thinking about last night," he'd written in one. "You looked incredible in that dress." "I've never felt this alive," Karen had replied. "You make me forget everything else." As I scrolled further, the messages grew more explicit, each one a dagger to the heart. They'd been meeting since February, slipping away to hotels, restaurants, even my own house when I was out of town. One particularly damning email confirmed my worst fear. Mark hadn't just been her lover. He'd planned to use her to destroy me. "Daniel's such a blind fool," Mark had written. "Keep playing your part, and we'll bleed him dry. Then it's just you and me." The next morning, I confronted Karen with the evidence. "You used me," I said, tossing a stack of printed emails onto the kitchen table. Karen stared at the papers, her face pale. "Where did you get these?" "That doesn't matter," I snapped. "What matters is that you betrayed me. Not just with him, but against me. You knew what he was doing, didn't you?" "I didn't," she began, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Karen. You knew exactly what he was after. You let him into our lives, into our bed, and you helped him try to ruin me." Her tears started again, but this time they felt hollow. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "I was lost, Daniel. He made me feel wanted. Wanted," I spat. "He made you feel wanted while robbing you blind. While robbing us blind. I thought he loved me," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought he used you," I said coldly. "And you let him." That evening, the kids were at a friend's house, and the silence in the house was deafening. Karen stayed in her room, the guilt and shame radiating off her in waves. I poured myself a drink, trying to process the mess my life had become. But as I sat there, another thought struck me. What if Mark wasn't done? His arrest didn't erase the debts Karen had accrued on his behalf, nor did it undo the legal jeopardy she'd placed us in. And then there was her betrayal, lingering like a wound that refused to heal. I needed a clean break, but I also needed the truth. All of it. The next day, I pressed Karen for details she'd been avoiding. "How did it start?" I asked, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "I want the truth this time." She hesitated, then sighed. "It was at a boutique expo in Dallas. He was charming, confident. He said he could help me take the business to the next level. And you fell for it," I said bitterly. Karen flinched but continued. "At first, it was just business. He helped me source inventory, set up marketing campaigns. But then, it became more." "How much more?" I pressed. Tears filled her eyes again. "I didn't mean for it to happen. The first time was after a meeting in Houston. We had drinks, and one thing led to another." "How many times?" I demanded, my voice low. She looked away. "I don't know. Too many." The admission hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood, unable to stay in the same room with her. Jake called later that week with another update. "Mark's case is expanding," he said. "Turns out he's connected to an international smuggling ring. The feds think he might flip to save his skin." "And Karen?" I asked. "They're still investigating her involvement. She might avoid charges if she cooperates fully." It was little comfort. Karen's cooperation wouldn't erase the betrayal, the lies, or the image of her with Mark. Sharing secrets meant to destroy me. Mark Davidson's arrest might have removed the immediate threat, but his shadow loomed over every corner of my life. Karen was cooperating with federal investigators, attending meetings with grim-faced agents who dissected every financial transaction she'd made with Mark. Each session left her looking more drained, but my sympathy had long since run dry. I focused on protecting what remained of my family and ensuring the divorce process left her with as little leverage as possible. If Karen wanted to play the victim, I was going to make damn sure the truth came out. The cracks in our facade became impossible to hide from the kids. Max, always perceptive, cornered me one night while Karen was out meeting her lawyers. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but wary. "You and Mom, you've barely spoken for weeks." I hesitated, torn between shielding him and being honest. "Your mom and I are going through something difficult," I said carefully. "But I need you to know none of it is your fault." "Is it about that guy?" Max asked suddenly. "The one she keeps texting?" My heart dropped. "What are you talking about?" "I saw her phone once," he said, fidgeting nervously. "It was during dinner. Some guy named Mark was texting her, calling her baby. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to make things worse." I placed a hand on his shoulder, forcing myself to stay calm. "It's okay, Max. Thank you for telling me." But inside, I was seething. Karen's recklessness had dragged our children into her web of lies. A few days later, Jake Marlowe called with chilling news. "Mark's making moves from jail," he said. "Word is he's trying to cut a deal with the feds. He's pointing fingers, Daniel, and Karen's one of them." I gripped the phone tightly. "What's he accusing her of?" "Laundering," Jake replied. "He claimed she was fully aware of the operation and helped funnel over $100,000. If he convinces them she was more involved than she's admitted, they could charge her." The thought of Karen in handcuffs didn't exactly fill me with sympathy. But as she went down, so did the boutique, and potentially the family finances. I couldn't let her mistakes bury the rest of us. "What do we do?" I asked. "Damage control," Jake said. "She needs to cooperate fully and show she was a pawn, not a partner. But it's going to get ugly." That night, I confronted Karen again. "Mark's throwing you under the bus," I told her bluntly. "He's telling the feds you were a willing accomplice." Karen's face went pale. "That's not true," she cried. "I didn't know what he was doing until it was too late." "Then you'd better convince them of that," I said coldly. "Because if you don't, this family goes down with you." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. But her remorse meant little to me now. I wasn't protecting her. I was protecting Max and Mia. As Karen scrambled to salvage her legal situation, I dug deeper into the damage she and Mark had caused. Through Jake's network, I discovered that Mark hadn't just siphoned money from Karen. He'd used her boutique as a front to smuggle counterfeit goods. Packages labeled as vintage inventory had been shipped across state lines, containing everything from fake designer handbags to illicit substances. The boutique's reputation was ruined. Customers left scathing reviews online, accusing Karen of fraud. Business dried up almost overnight, and with it, her last shred of independence. The final nail in the coffin came 2 weeks later. Karen returned from another meeting with federal agents, her face a mask of defeat. "They're offering me a deal," she said quietly. "If I testify against Mark and provide full access to my records, I won't face charges." "And what's the catch?" I asked, though I already knew. She looked away. "They'll seize the boutique. It'll cover part of the money he laundered." I let out a bitter laugh. "So you lose everything. Congratulations, Karen. You've destroyed our marriage, your business, and any chance at a normal life." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. But I didn't comfort her. Instead, I walked away, leaving her to drown in the mess she'd created. The divorce was finalized within a month. I was awarded primary custody of Max and Mia, while Karen was left with a mountain of debt and a reputation in ruins. She moved into a small apartment across town, her once bright future dimmed by her choices. As for Mark, his deal with the feds earned him a reduced sentence, but he'd burned every bridge in the process. Word was his partners in the smuggling ring were less than pleased with his cooperation. Months later, as I watched my kids laugh together over dinner, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The storm was over, and though the scars remained, I knew we'd weather them together. Life settled into a tentative rhythm after the divorce. The house felt quieter without Karen, but not emptier. Max and Mia adapted well to the new normal, their laughter and bickering a reminder of what I was fighting to protect. For the first time in months, the weight of Mark's betrayal, Karen's lies, and the financial chaos began to lift. But peace, it seemed, wasn't meant to last. One chilly November evening, as I was helping Max with a school project, my phone buzzed. It was Jake Marlowe. "Daniel," he said, his tone urgent. "We got a problem." "What now?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Mark's deal with the feds fell apart," Jake said. "Turns out he held back information. They rescinded his plea bargain, and now he's looking at serious time." I exhaled sharply. "Good. Let him rot." Jake's hesitation on the other end told me there was more. "That's not the issue," he continued. "Word is he's blaming you for his downfall. Apparently, he found out about our investigation. He knows you tipped off the authorities." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you should be careful," Jake said gravely. "Mark's a vindictive guy. Even from behind bars, he could cause trouble. And if he gets out—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. I spent the next few weeks on edge. Every knock at the door, every unexpected call, set my nerves on fire. Jake suggested installing a security system, so I added cameras and motion detectors to the house. I even bought a pistol and took a crash course at a local shooting range. I wasn't taking chances, not with my kids under my roof. Karen, meanwhile, had gone radio silent. Her legal troubles had consumed her, and she rarely reached out beyond obligatory calls to Max and Mia. I thought I was done with her drama, until she showed up on my doorstep. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the knock. Opening the door, I found Karen standing there, clutching a small duffel bag. She looked disheveled, her eyes darting nervously. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "I need your help." "Help?" I barked a bitter laugh. "You must be joking." "Please," she pleaded. "It's Mark. He sent someone after me." My blood turned cold. "What do you mean, sent someone?" "He called me from prison," she said, stepping inside uninvited. "Said I'd pay for betraying him. A man showed up at my apartment last night, tall, shaved head, tattoos. He said Mark doesn't forgive." I ran a hand through my hair, trying to process her words. "Why come here? Why not call the police?" "I did," she cried. "They told me they'd look into it, but they can't protect me 24/7. I didn't know where else to go." I clenched my jaw, torn between fury and a begrudging sense of duty. Despite everything, Karen was the mother of my children. If Mark's reach extended this far, none of us were safe. That night, I set up a makeshift watch. Karen slept on the couch while I stayed up, monitoring the security cameras. Hours passed uneventfully, but my mind raced. If Mark was targeting Karen, how long before he came for me? Or worse, Max and Mia? At around 3 a.m., a motion alert pinged my phone. I checked the camera feed and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the driveway, partially obscured by shadows. I grabbed the pistol from my nightstand and moved silently to the front door. Karen woke as I passed the living room, her eyes widening. "What is it?" she whispered. "Stay here," I said, gripping the gun tightly. I opened the door slowly, stepping onto the porch. The figure moved closer, and as the dim light revealed his face, my stomach twisted. It was Victor Cardoza, the muscle Jake had warned me about. Victor stopped a few feet from the porch, his hands casually in his pockets. "Relax, Morgan," he said, his voice smooth. "I'm not here to make a scene." "Then why are you here?" I growled, keeping the gun trained on him. "Mark sent me with a message," he said. "He wants you to know he hasn't forgotten. And neither should you." "That a threat?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Call it a warning," Victor replied. "Mark's got friends on the outside. You keep your head down and maybe they won't come knocking." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I locked the door and returned to the living room, my mind racing. Karen looked at me, her face pale. "What did he say?" she asked. "That Mark hasn't forgotten," I said grimly. "And neither should we." Victor Cardoza's visit left an unmistakable message. Mark wasn't done with us. Karen's betrayal had entangled our lives in a web of danger that now extended far beyond financial ruin. The next morning, I called Jake Marlowe, relaying the encounter in grim detail. "Cardoza showing up means Mark's pulling strings faster than I thought," Jake said. We need to end this permanently. How? I asked. He's locked up. Sure, Jake replied. But his network isn't. We need leverage, something big enough to neutralize him and his associates. Jake dug into Mark's remaining connections while I fortified the house. Karen stayed under my roof, much to my resentment, claiming she had nowhere else to go. Her presence felt like a ticking time bomb, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon her entirely. Now all the kids were still in her orbit. A week later, Jake called with a breakthrough. I found something, he said, excitement tinged with urgency. Mark's offshore accounts, the ones he used for laundering? Turns out, they weren't just about money. He's tied to a trafficking ring. I gripped the phone tightly. Trafficking? What kind? Human, Jake said darkly. He's part of a pipeline moving people across borders. If we can prove his involvement, it'll bury him and anyone working with him. We worked fast. Jake coordinated with federal agents, compiling evidence from bank transfers, shipping manifests, and testimonies from victims. Meanwhile, I stayed vigilant, ensuring the house remained secure. Every night felt like a battle against the encroaching shadows Mark had left behind. The breaking point came 3 days later. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when the security system's alarm blared. My heart pounded as I grabbed the pistol and checked the camera feed. 3 men were approaching the house, their faces obscured by hoodies. Karen, I shouted, get the kids into the panic room. Now. She froze, her eyes wide with fear, but then nodded and rushed upstairs. I locked the front door and positioned myself near the window, the pistol steady in my hands. The men reached the porch, their movements calculated. One of them tried the door handle, finding it locked. He gestured to the others, and they began circling the house, testing windows. I called Jake, keeping my voice low. They're here. Stay calm, he said. I'm calling the cops now. Hold your ground. The minutes felt like hours. The men found a back window and began prying it open. My instincts screamed at me to act, but I held back, waiting for the right moment. When the first man climbed through the window, I stepped into view, the pistol aimed squarely at his chest. Not another step, I said coldly. He froze, his hands raised slightly. Easy, man, he said, his voice low. We're just here for a chat. Funny way to start a conversation, I replied. Get out. Now. The second man appeared behind him, his posture tense. We're here for Karen, he said. Mark sent us to bring her back. She's not going anywhere, I said, my finger hovering over the trigger. You've got 5 seconds to leave. Before they could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. The men exchanged glances, then bolted for the woods behind the house. Moments later, police cars swarmed the property, their lights cutting through the darkness. The officers took statements from me and Karen, while Jake arrived to assess the situation. They'll try again, he warned. Mark's desperate, and desperate men make reckless choices. What do we do? Karen asked, her voice shaking. Jake turned to me. We finished this. The following day, Jake and the federal agents executed their plan. Using the trafficking evidence, they coordinated a sting operation targeting Mark's network. The operation was swift and decisive, dismantling the infrastructure he'd spent years building. Dozens of arrests followed, severing his influence both inside and outside the prison walls. Mark's attempt to retaliate against me and Karen became part of the case against him, adding years to his already lengthy sentence. Victor Cardoza, implicated as one of Mark's enforcers, was also arrested. With the threat neutralized, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Karen moved into a small rental apartment, her relationship with the kids strained but salvageable. I finalized the sale of the boutique, using the proceeds to cover the debts she had left behind. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching Max and Mia chase fireflies, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. The storm had passed, leaving scars but also clarity. My marriage was over, my trust shattered, but my determination to protect my family had never wavered. Karen's betrayal would always haunt me, but it had also taught me resilience. Mark's schemes had failed, and his name faded into the background. A ghost of a dark chapter finally closed. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow. Goodbye.